We 100% expected that the higher carbohydrate group would perform better because everything had suggested it would. But yet when we actually studied it, when we did not assume anymore and actually put it to the test in a laboratory setting, lo and behold, we were wrong.
Wellness isn't black and white, so why should your choices be? On High Energy Life, we dig into nutrition, health, and science with an open mind, inspiring you to make choices that actually work for you. Our mantra? Embrace nuance, ask questions, and always reserve the right to change your mind. Now enjoy today's episode. I'm your host, Carly.
And I'm your host, Alex.
For our podcast episode today, I had the amazing fortune to talk with Dr. Andrew Koutnik, an accomplished researcher studying metabolic health, specializing in athletic performance and diabetes management. He himself is an athlete and has had to manage his own type 1 diabetes for much of his life, so he has intimate details and data surrounding blood glucose management. Dr. Koutnik is part of a team led by Professor Tim Noakes, a prominent figure in the world of endurance running, that recently published a very substantial scientific review paper proposing a novel theory regarding sports nutrition fueling. We immediately jumped into the topic pretty deep, so to add some context before I play the conversation, I'd like to provide a brief background about my experience and why I've been so drawn to Andrew's work. So growing up, I was a borderline elite athlete, qualifying for national level competitions as an age group swimmer, and then I transitioned to become a top competitor for the University of Wisconsin triathlon team during my college years. Shortly out of college, new to working a 9-to-5 desk job, I started experiencing some general health issues, and after a bit of research, I decided to experiment with a ketogenic, a very low-carb diet. I was willing to sacrifice athletic performance in the favor of my long-term health and actually stop training altogether. I felt so fantastic so quickly that I maintained my ketogenic diet for over 2 years. I now regularly cycle in and out of a ketogenic diet, but with my near decade of nutrition research, I've realized those 2 years initiated some amazing physiologic health benefits that I've maintained since throughout my nutritional cycling. Until last year, age 31, I hadn't put any focus on athletic training. Some casual weightlifting, a bit of bike commuting, and hiking were my main forms of general exercise, nothing more. 9 years after my last triathlon, I started biking regularly again, and within a month, I was exceeding my performance compared to my 21-year-old self competing at USA Triathlon Collegiate Nationals. Not only has a part-time ketogenic diet not crippled my athletic performance, my athletic abilities have improved basically without training. It's of course impossible to isolate the variables of 10 years of life, but I have no other reasonable explanation other than a shift in my diet that, until post-college graduation, was entirely in line with classic endurance athletic recommendations. My engineering brain has been seeking an explanation as to how this is possible, and so I was already primed to dive into Dr. Koutnik's publication. Our conversation dives in deep, and I encourage you to listen to the entire conversation and, if you enjoy it, listen to his interviews with Nick Norowitz, the Science Training Podcast, and Metabolic Mind, and probably many others that I haven't even listened to. But very briefly, his research calls into question the long-held belief that muscle glycogen, or sugar that's stored in our muscles, is the obligatory fuel for high-level performance. As you'll hear, lab testing has been unable to prove ultra-high-carb diets and high-carb supplementation during exercise necessarily leads to improved performance. Koutnik and his team adapted athletes using a ketogenic diet and compared performance across a range of carbohydrate intakes. There's lots of nuance and many outstanding questions that I still have that are yearning to be answered. So let's jump in for you to hear from the star of the show. Thank you so much, Dr. Koutnik, for joining me today. To just get started, could you provide a very brief overview of what this massive review was all about?
Sure. So when we were looking into trying to understand what fueled sports performance, we had done a number of key trials that really came as a little bit of a shock to us. We had a hypothesis that some of the results we were going to see in some of our trials when looking at things like high and low carb ketogenic diets, that we saw results that we didn't expect to see. And to give a brief example of that, so in 2023, this is actually a study that was published in 2023, which means it was ongoing 2 years prior to that. We had looked at, high intense, over 85% of someone's maximal aerobic capacity, 6 by 800 meter sprints, 1 mile max effort time trials, and recreational runners. So individuals who are competing in local or regional events, highly fit, low body fat, and we asked them to come in and do either a high carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic diet for at least 4 weeks in duration. And we were interested about that simply because many sports performance studies or metabolic studies don't control a lot of key variables, one of which is the duration on diet. We have known for arguably since the 1960s, so going on 60 years, that there's a number of key changes that happen over time. There's rapid changes that come along with diet-induced change of a ketogenic diet. Some of your audience may have heard of things like keto adaptation. Otherwise, we won't go into too much detail unless you're interested. But in short, we know that some of these changes persist beyond 3 weeks, some of which seem quite critical to brain energy metabolism. And as a consequence, we felt it was important to persist the diet for at least 4 weeks in duration, which a lot of studies had not previously. We controlled calories, activity, body weight, essentially a lot of things that in studies are not often controlled, but do impact performance and also impact metabolism. And so when we controlled that, we found that when individuals consume low carbohydrate intakes or ketogenic diets, we found that despite doing very high levels of intense work, which we typically believe in exercise science to be more carbohydrate dominant forms of exercise like sprinting, we saw that there was no difference in sports performance in these athletes, whether they're doing 6 by 800 meter sprints or doing 1 mile max effort time trials. And that facilitated a secondary study where we looked at the opposite end of the spectrum, which is 2 to 4 plus hours duration exercise in actual Ironman competitors, individuals who had completed a half Ironman, were doing high volumes of exercise and asked them to go as long as they possibly could on a high or low carbohydrate based diet. And again, to our surprise, in both of these analyses, both sprint-based 1 mile max effort time trials or a 2 to 4 plus hour long prolonged strenuous form of endurance exercise, we saw that athletes were not seeing any deterioration in performance when they were consuming very low carbohydrate intake. And that really went against virtually every sports nutrition guideline that's out there: American College of Sports Medicine, the Dietetics Association of America and Canada, International Society of Sports Nutrition, and Gatorade Sports Science Institute. So all these put out guidelines on how much you consume, which ranges anywhere between 5 to 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. And we were consuming infinitely lower than that and seeing no deterioration in performance. And we didn't expect that by any means, by the way. We 100% expected that the higher carbohydrate group would perform better because everything had suggested it would. But yet when we actually studied it, when we did not assume anymore and actually put it to the test in a laboratory setting, lo and behold, we were wrong. And not only were we wrong, when we went on to study it again, we were once again baffled by being incorrect about what was going to happen. I thought that in a prolonged form of strenuous exercise, that there was this theory that ketogenic diets, you would have additional fuel in the form of fat, and you would, in theory, not bonk. Not true. Ketogenic athletes also bonked, but they had no deterioration in their performance, though, compared to high-carb diets. So again, not my hypothesis, not what I expected, but again, upended my belief at least, and also was something we were ongoing to understand why, when we control these variables and do rigorous randomized controlled trials, are we not seeing what everyone else is endorsing as the way that you have to fuel to perform?
I'm going to pause quickly here for a recap and to emphasize some of my personal key takeaways. Andrew and his team sought to correct prior study flaws by allowing sufficient time for keto adaptation before testing athletes sprinting, training 6 by 800 meter repeats, racing 1 mile max efforts, and completing half Ironman efforts. There was no difference in performance found compared to a conventional high-carb approach. So a number of things here to hone in on. To reiterate, the athletes tested on a low-carb approach were allowed to adapt metabolically over 4 weeks, something that similar studies rarely do. Then the athletes tested across a massive range of distances and therefore intensities, from sprints to 1 mile max efforts to 4+ hour races. None of the disciplines revealed any difference in performance between a high carb and drastically reduced carb approach. That appears to have been a surprise to the team. Next, the theory then that maybe an ability to tap into fat stores for energy should result in keto-adapted athletes performing indefinitely, much longer than a conventional high-carb approach, given that they have much greater fuel storage abilities. That was also wrong. Keto athletes bonked similarly to high-carb athletes. So a lot of questions arise then, but ultimately, why does the last 60 years of sports nutrition science claim high carbohydrate intake is required?
And so we look back at 100 years of evidence. It included around 600 research studies, over 160 different sports performance studies, and looked at what was the key impact that carbohydrates have not only on metabolism during exercise, but also on performance outcomes. And what we were seeing is that when carbohydrates improve performance, 88% of those studies showed that in the placebo or control group, the ones who didn't receive carbohydrates, had a drop in blood glucose levels. No other metric was as consistent at reliably not only predicting what caused or signaled an indication of a sports performance improvement with a carbohydrate intake, but it also, at the same time, brought into question around what were some of the key determinants of performance. So we looked at various studies that have actually looked at other metrics that are commonly described since the 1960s, muscle glycogen, since the 1970s and 80s, the amount of carbohydrate substrate use, or what we call carbohydrate oxidation levels. All these had been associated with performance, but never had been causally linked. But when we actually did manipulative studies to directly test that, where we did interventions that specifically lowered glycogen, lowered carb oxidation levels, and compared them to higher carbohydrate oxidation levels and higher glycogen levels, we weren't seeing differences in performance, which if those measures were key determinants of performance or the most important determinants of performance, we should have seen a difference in performance, and we weren't. And we weren't the only ones, by the way. Numerous other studies had shown the same thing. And so what this analysis really had brought to light is that there are key regulatory mechanisms that distinguish how the body actually metabolizes things like carbohydrates during exercise. You have what we call the large glucose pool, which is the muscle, which houses upwards, if you're an average body weight male, over 500 plus grams of glucose in it in the form of glycogen, stored glucose molecules. And then you also have in women over 300 plus grams, depending on body weight, your training status, and all these other factors. And so when we look at those key variables and actually compare, okay, is this a key determinant of performance, or is the amount of carbohydrates someone oxidized a key determinant of performance? We were seeing multiple key examples in the literature of this not being a reliable primary predictor of performance. In fact, we know that if things like muscle glycogen levels get depleted, and it's never at zero, by the way, or just dramatically reduced, ATP production is still equivalent in the muscle, right? So then what is the cause? If we believe that muscle glycogen levels are the cause, we're failing to elucidate a reasonable explanation for why that is. But we've known for over 100 years that the maintenance of brain energy metabolism in the form of glucose has been shown to and has been known to mechanistically change or induce early onset fatigue. So there's a study in the 1920s by Harvard physicians who actually studied athletes running the Boston Marathon and found that individuals who were stopping early, running into early onset fatigue, getting ataxia, or unable to actually articulate their words correctly, were running into what's called hypoglycemia, or low blood sugar levels. So we've known for over 100 years that the maintenance of brain energy metabolism through maintained blood glucose levels is a critical determinant of exercise performance. And all the pivotal studies in the 1960s, Jonas Bergstrom studies that showed muscle glycogen was associated with performance, also show that it mitigated hypoglycemia. But the authors focused on glycogen, not on hypoglycemia. Same thing in the 1970s and 1980s, when they showed an association between the amount of carbohydrates that were being oxidized in sports performance. They also showed that carbohydrates prevented hypoglycemia. And we know the mechanism by which hypoglycemia induces early onset fatigue. It's obviously a survival mechanism. The brain is protecting itself from other tissues stealing away its critical nutrients to maintain its own metabolism. We've known this for a long time, but we fail to really understand truly the mechanisms by which, let's say, something as like glycogen or carbohydrate oxidation levels actually causally manipulate performance. And we can go into animal studies and other things like that that have actually attempted to look at causal relationships that only reinforce this. So this review is really looking at those two glucose pools, how exercise in the context of carbohydrates is altered, or at least metabolically speaking, and what are the implications of that on performance. And many people can draw a lot of interpretive impacts of this, of which they have. But actually the main point of the review is actually to look at the biology of carbohydrates during sports performance.
Fantastic. I can imagine how much work went into it. But there's a lot to unpack in there. So I want to to start with that. So as an athlete, the first thing that comes to mind is outside of, for myself, I'm very interested in the biology, but my main focus as an athlete is, and everybody that I coach, is performance. I want to have the highest level of performance possible. And so I do want to make a distinction in this conversation between elite athletes that I've heard you say before that no athlete should sacrifice their health for performance. I agree to a certain extent, but pick a sport and a lot of very, very elite athletes, and let's take the NFL, for example, in football. At this point, many athletes know that they're in danger of brain damage, and they still decide to do it. Now, I think that an athlete at that level should have the knowledge of what are potential trade-offs that they're making, but make those trade-offs consciously. So if we're just looking at performance, separating the elite of the elite that they're making a living via sport, and everybody else, myself included, my background is I was a borderline elite athlete growing up, but I still categorize myself as a very competitive recreational athlete. So making a distinction between those two groups. So first, I do want to look at performance of the elite of the elite. A lot of your paper that you published was about reviewing prior studies around performance, but my understanding is you've also done testing on athletes in lab settings as well between different high carb and fat adapted metabolism. So when it comes to that performance, what are the different disciplines? So distances, sprint versus endurance versus, at this point, ultra endurance. What different disciplines have you tested in a lab setting? And then what level of athletes did you perform this testing on?
Yeah, great question. So we can focus on two of the pivotal studies that we've spoke about before, and then kind of give a bigger breadth of what's out there. But then I also want to talk about the elite versus non-elite, because I think you brought that up initially, and it's actually one of the most important parts of this conversation, because it's almost instantly the reaction that came out of our paper, despite, of course, 99% of studies not being elite athletes. Okay, so that's an important point to discuss, because there is valid points brought up about those criticisms around elite athletes. So we should definitely dive into that. But to talk more specifically, so we've looked at recreational runners. We've looked at Ironman competitors. There's also been meta-analysis in resistance exercise settings where you're looking at various forms of weight training, whether it be upper, lower, mixed forms of weight training that have shown impacts of carbohydrates or the impact of it, essentially showing that less than 45 minutes in duration doesn't seem to have any benefit from carbohydrate intake, but greater than 45 minutes. And if it's sufficiently strenuous, they can benefit from it, which again is also very aligned with what we've shown here. But most of the studies, which is an important point, is usually in endurance settings. And there's a reason for that. Because endurance settings allows for not mixed up and down variable levels of intensity. You can actually do what we like to do in science, which is control variables and set intensities at sustained levels and make it sustainably hard for sufficiently long, right? So like when one of the studies we did in Ironman competitors, and we asked them to sustain 70% of their VO2 max for as long as they could possibly go. Some athletes went north of 4 hours, some a little over 2 hours, et cetera, right? The point of that study was not to was so one of the criticisms of that study was, oh, you didn't do a mixed intensity form of exercise. Yeah, I know. Why would you do that? Why would you do a mixed intensity form of exercise? It's going to completely destroy the metabolic control you have in the analysis for the point of the study. Of course, you're not going to do that. Anyone who's done these studies would not do that. But that's a valid point because, yes, athletes go through mixed forms of intensity throughout an exercise bout. And obviously, that creates a big confounding effect. And so most of the studies are in endurance settings at controlled levels of intensity, or they control a level of intensity and then allow for all-out max effort, right? And so we've done similar things to that where it's a time trial for a set distance, or we see how fast someone could complete a certain level of intense exercise, like sprints, for a set amount of time, right? And so there's all these different ways of doing it, but I will acknowledge up front that most of these are not in elite athletes. Most of these are in endurance context, but there have been studies in resistance exercise formats looking at carbohydrate administration, and those have been summarized by Andrew King and Eric Reynolds and otherwise, and through some meta-analysis showing that the summary of results and when carbohydrates are beneficial or not in those settings.
With the controlling of the intensity, I can imagine that. So my background as when I was growing up, I was a swimmer, and then in college transitioned into triathlon. And in those disciplines, especially triathlon, where it's an endurance sport, my races took just over 2 hours, but it's an individual sport for the most part, where my race is at basically the lactate threshold or as close to VO2 max as I can sustain, but my performance has nothing to do with anybody else's performance. If I'm drafting on the bike, I get penalized for that. And in that setting, it's a steady state effort. But in a setting, say, a draft legal bike race, or we can go to the extreme, the Tour de France, where now I have to react to attacks on the bike where I have to go above my VO2 threshold for a short period of time in order to respond or attack myself, and then I pull back and have to get back into my threshold very rapidly. Do you think that, based on your research, are there instances in different disciplines like that that may require utilizing a much higher carb approach versus an athlete that can sit at their lactate threshold and just burn through their fat stores as bulk of their energy?
So the best case for that is exactly what you illustrated, and typically on the elite end. And the reason being is because the logic is that, and we've even shown this in some of our analysis with Philip Prinz and Grove City College as a key collaborator in some of these analyses, that even when athletes, not necessarily elite athletes, and you would expect elite would just push the curve over a bit more, but when you see individuals who are certainly not just weekend warriors, but actually are competing in regional events and actually running high volumes, let's say running, for example, you see that when you put these athletes on low carbohydrate ketogenic diets or high carbohydrate diets, there's a phenomenon where you shift over the crossover effect. Meaning, if for those of the audience who are not familiar with that, and it's that the idea that if you go from, let's say, we're sitting down, or maybe you're standing, I'm not sure, but I'm sitting right now. So let's say I'm sitting, and now I get up and I start walking. And then I start walking as fast as I can before I have to start running. I do a brisk run. And then I start running fast enough to where I can barely talk. And then I go to a sprint, right? This incremental increase in intensity would, based on all our understanding of exercise physiology, would increase the amount of carbohydrates being utilized by the athlete, most predominantly at the higher end of the intensity. And that is still true of athletes who are adapted to low carbohydrate, high fat forms of a diet. The crossover effect is just shifted over dramatically to the right, where we've seen that some athletes are able to metabolize even at 85+% of their VO2 max over 1.85 grams per minute of fat, which illustrates the highest ever levels of fat oxidation recorded because no one had actually pushed athletes to that level fully fat, or at least adapted for 4 weeks on a ketogenic diet. It was always assumed that, okay, what we're seeing at 3 weeks and 5 days or less in these studies would be equivalent to what we see at 4+ weeks. And what we're seeing is that's not the case. And when we actually put the intensity threshold, not threshold, but intensity level high enough, we see that they were able to maintain their performance with record levels of fat oxidation, which, by the way, for context experimentally, is likely an underestimation of the amount of fat that was being burned. Because we know that the tools we actually utilize to measure fat and carb burning are these gas exchange techniques. So it captures the amount of oxygen you breathe in, the amount of CO2 or carbon dioxide you breathe out or exhale. And based on the ratio of those two, it estimates the amount of fat or carbohydrates you burn. Well, even if you're a low carbohydrate, high fat, ketogenic like athlete, and you get to these higher intensity thresholds, you're still going to be producing producing higher levels of lactate, higher levels of CO2 production. At the very top end, you're going to artificially deflate the amount of fat actually being burned at those higher intensities because of the amount of carbon dioxide in the body that's actually produced is artificially inflated at these higher acid loads. And as a result, even though you might have been burning more fat, the measurement's actually going to show that you're burning slightly more carbohydrates than you actually were at the higher intensities. So I just say that to say it's shifting over the crossover point to the right more so. What that means is even though we've done a full crossover point analysis in low carbohydrate athletes, and we still see there is a crossover point. It still exists. It's just shifted over to the right. So what if you're one of these extremely high level or elite athletes and you tap into those higher levels more often? Because that's one of the characteristics of some of the highest caliber athletes is their ability to maintain higher percentages of their VO2 max for longer. And would carbohydrates be beneficial? Oh, absolutely. And as for the record, our own research shows that carbohydrates are beneficial. So let's clarify that up front. But yes, it's absolutely true that at these higher intensities at sustained levels, it is possible that carbohydrates could provide greater levels of benefit. But that is hypothetical. Because when a lot of people point to, and this has been mentioned a few times, like I have the most amount of respect for this individual named Steve Magnus. He brought up a point like, look, Kenyan runners are running over 70% of the calories are from carbohydrates, 20% is from sugar. Carbohydrates here are great for the highest caliber of athletes. But what's interesting is that there are athletes consuming that same diet and are nowhere near as fast as these Kenyan runners. So is it the diet? Is it? Because when we do the most controlled analysis of all time, or not all time, but like some of the most controlled analysis out there, where we tried to control many of the confounding variables, so a very controlled analysis, to actually elucidate the impacts of shifting around macronutrients, okay, specifically lowering carbs and elevating fat. We're just not consistently seeing a performance difference when you shift them around. And why is that important? Well, someone will say, well, it wasn't a real world setting. I know, because in the real world setting, you have infinite amount of confounding variables that prevent you from actually answering the question whether the macronutrients were the cause of a performance difference. But in a laboratory setting, you can control that. And that's why we did it that way. It wasn't a limitation, it was the point. And when we actually look at those studies where we actually controlled a lot of these confounding variables, we're not seeing a difference. So if we would have seen a difference, Alex, and it's true, like let's say it's true, if you consume higher levels of carbohydrates versus lower levels of carbohydrates, and look, all these elite athletes are doing it at high levels and they're getting faster and faster. Okay, then if it's the case, let's do everything to control all the other variables that we know are ongoing right now. Super shoes. Basically give a spring in every single step, reduce about 5 seconds for every kilometer, mechanical advantages, training monitor. Let's remove all these other variables that have evolved in recent time alongside athletes increasing carbohydrate intake. And let's just look at the difference in the diet. And when we do that, you would expect if it was the cause and we control all the other variables, we'd see a difference. But what are we not seeing, Alex? A difference. So that gets to a really critical point. Is it possible that elite athletes are in fact uniquely more capable in a hypothetical sense of utilizing more carbohydrates because they tap into higher levels of their VO2 max more consistently? Absolutely. Absolutely that is possible. And it makes a lot of sense. But there are examples of athletes who are consuming no carbohydrates and running elite level times. There are ketogenic athletes at the highest level. One criticism of that argument, and you probably would bring this up, is, well, they're not actually common. So it seems like it's the exception, not the rule. And I would say, sure, that makes a lot of sense. But we can't negate the precedent since the 1970s of sports nutrition guidelines, all the supporting associative evidence on carb loading and glycogen, the fact that when you consume carbohydrates, just like we showed, it does improve performance, at least if it's sufficiently strenuous and prolonged. But here's the kicker. If you consume any of them, they seem to improve performance, again, within that context. But no one's really looking at less. Everyone's trying to push more and more and more. So it's this confirmatory analysis of, well, obviously, if they improve performance and I just give more, they're obviously going to, it must mean they're going to get better. But actually, if you look at dose response studies, and actually we show a table in this in our analysis, it's amazing because it's all over the map. There's no consistency in these outcomes with dose response studies with carbohydrates. You would expect them to be if there was a consistent phenomenon that higher carbohydrates produce better outcomes. There is one single analysis that I'm aware of by James Morton's group that showed a clear dose-dependent improvement in performance with higher carbohydrate load from 30, 60, 90 to 120. Every other study does not show that. They're either showing that once you get just enough, you have a performance improvement from versus nothing, and then really there's not much of a graded improvement beyond a certain level. In fact, there's some analysis from Smith et al. That show, yeah, like there's an improvement at 30 grams versus nothing. It's kind of pretty consistent, marginal improvements up to a max improvement around 80 grams. But then when you get past 80 grams, you actually have a deterioration in performance in these athletes. But yet everyone's saying, look, 90 to 120 grams is what everyone's doing now, and they're busting through times. So I get back to the original point. If that was true, then we would control all the other variables outside of nutrition and test just the nutritional effects, and we would expect to see a clear response. And we're just not consistently seeing that, which brings into question, do we really think the best athletes in the world are in fact the best athletes in the world because of the diet they're consuming? Or is it maybe the training they're doing? Their parents, their genetics that they got from their parents, the psychology they have towards performance. Obviously, nutrition is super important, but don't get me wrong. And it is, if you have poor nutrition, it could be a disaster for sure. But if you have adequate nutrition, it seems like what a lot of our findings are illustrating is that athletes actually have options. There isn't one way to do this, that there are an array of options to do this. And there is super important nuance in that because we've seen in some athletes, they can run into issues like elevated glucose levels consistent with prediabetes. And we're not the only people to see this, by the way. There is other reports that show up to 60% of some athletes, and there's anecdotal reports of some of the highest level athletes in the world experiencing this. So it's obviously a real phenomenon, but that gets to a point that it comes down to an individual level. So your coach, right? That's where the nuance and power comes in, because obviously what we're showing is just the science that's happened over 100 years. And looking at the way in which carbohydrates are regulated in metabolism, how they affect sports performance, and also what is the strength of the evidence around focusing on other metrics? Because when focusing on these two pools of glucose, the large muscle pool and the small muscle or glucose pool, the large glucose pool, if you focus on that and it's the priority and it's the primary thing determining performance, then you would need to load up a substantial amount of carbohydrates to satisfy that because you burn them down. And if you have 500 plus grams, you would need to consume that and or more to sustain not only caloric sufficiency, but also retaining and or rebuilding the muscle glycogen that you burned. But again, I'll get back to the original point. We would expect to see differences when we control the variables, and we don't. But is there cases where that hasn't been explored, where it's absolutely possible where carbohydrates would be more useful? Yeah, and the toppest end of intensity level, that is an example where that would be the case. But there are exceptions to that, and we know of them.
There's a lot again here I want to unpack. So to start out with, the conversations on X, you mentioned Steve Magnus and Zach Bitter, who has used a fat-based approach for setting records in ultramarathons himself, was arguing on, okay, the endurance but not ultra-endurance, so marathon-level athletes, we see in a real world, these elite athletes are almost exclusively using the super high carb approach. And so a lot of discussion around, if it were a competitive advantage to base our metabolism off of fat versus carbs, then we should be seeing that in real life, and we're not. So focusing in specifically on that, do you think that is a reasonable criticism of if it were beneficial, we would be seeing it, and we're not at the most elite level, therefore it can't be true?
I think it's a totally reasonable criticism. I think it makes total sense. Actually, it's one of the best actual points, I thought, of all the criticisms that were brought up around the analysis, without a doubt. However, there are exceptions to this all the time, including resistance exercise around sports. It was, once that was discouraged. Like, this is an extreme example. Okay, I'm not using this as an analogous example. But at one point, they were promoting smoking. Okay, and that's obviously was ridiculous. So I'm not saying that this is an extremely valid point, absolutely valid, but when a lot of the explanations utilized to justify those approaches, when you look at the evidence, they're not justifiable. Okay, so then that means that if they are in fact improving performance, that we're hypothesizing they are ahead of the science. Okay, not because the science is overwhelmingly showing that they are in fact required for performance.
What I have not really seen from people that are arguing against your findings is, which you already mentioned briefly, we're improving on multiple different fronts constantly in sports. So you mentioned genetics is one of them, obviously. Yeah. Equipment, so carbon-plated shoes for running, and our bikes are getting more aerodynamic and lighter. And then on the nutrition front, to my understanding, is when you get to the Tour de France, the elite level, at the same time that we started pushing the carbs per hour boundary from 80 up to 100 to 120 to higher than that, we've also seen exogenous ketones, so this other fuel source, and especially a brain fuel source, supplementing those during exercise, that's come on the scene at the same time. In your opinion, how should somebody just looking and observing elite athletes and how they're performing, how can they go about trying to separate the benefits of 120 grams of sugar per hour versus the ketone supplementation that these cyclists are also doing?
So you put that together brilliantly. I actually have very little to add to the context of that, other than one exception. Athletes are doing things well beyond what you're describing also. Okay, the boundaries are being pushed in all sorts of fronts. Okay, there are a lot of things that are constantly pushing the boundaries here. Okay, it isn't just the amount of carbohydrates that athletes are consuming. All right, so there's many reasons why this could be a play. Yes, we've known, so exogenous ketones have been studied. They were actually originally, so exogenous ketones have been around, depending on how you classify them, since the 1950s and 60s. So if you include medium chain triglycerides as an exogenous form of fuel that converts into ketone bodies, these have actually been studied therapeutically for malnutrition disorders for children, and we're successful at helping with that. We've known with studies in epilepsy and all these different contexts, its direct effect on modulating brain activity. We know that exogenous ketones can improve brain network stability, lower certain inflammatory signals, have antioxidant effects. I mean, they're not like magic fairy dust or anything, but there's a lot of incredible data around their use, particularly around the brain. And some of the original work was actually funded by DARPA from the Department of Defense, called Metabolic Dominance Project, where Oxford and NIH were actually funded to develop a novel ketone product, which was the monoester. And they showed an improvement in high-level cyclists. And that really caused an explosion in research in exogenous ketone world. We've done a lot of studies in various forms of exogenous ketones on cognition and physical performance. And it really depends on what you're consuming, when you're consuming it, and how you're consuming it. But they obviously clearly have some benefit, particularly when they're supplemented over time for chronic periods of time in some athletes. Like, we have a recent study that's about to be published, and it hasn't actually come out yet, administering the highest ever administered dose of exogenous ketones at over 100 grams per day for up to 30 days, and showed that it improved cognition, and that after you stop taking them, that there is a sustained effect on oxygen uptake, or the ability to sustain more efficient use of oxygen at higher levels of exercise intensity after you stop taking them altogether, which is aligned with some of the work from Chale Puff's group and Peter Hespel, who actually showed that if you sustainably take ketones just after exercise, that you can actually see some chronic adaptations to, or changes in things like elevations, at least acute studies in elevations in EPO, but that's aligned with changes in training volume that was attenuated over training. It also, they saw changes in vascularization and capillarization in the muscle tissue. And there's a number of studies that have shown that the oxygen uptake, including our work funded by Special Operations Command, looking at exogenous ketones in high altitude environments and low oxygen availability, that it can improve cognitive performance. Because we saw higher SpO2 levels, higher oxygen uptake with ketones, which has also been shown at the muscle level.
That's really fascinating, because one of the criticisms that I was going to ask you about after this specifically is about oxygen economy, because to produce the same amount of energy, ATP, cellular energy from fats versus carbohydrates, you need more oxygen to produce that ATP from fats. And so if you have an elite athlete that is able to sustain a 90+% intensity effort of their VO2 max, or the maximum rate that they can use oxygen, it seems like, okay, this might be a failure then of fat metabolism versus carb metabolism. But from what you're saying, ketones are, they're a signaling molecule that allows our body to adapt and become more efficient at uptaking the oxygen available and utilizing it. Do I have that somewhat correct?
So what's interesting is you actually brought up a point I've never actually thought of before, which is you are 100% correct that there is plenty of research that has consistently shown that the amount of ATP, or the efficiency of carbohydrates per unit of oxygen is higher than it is for things like fat. However, when we directly compare sports performance and compare them versus very low carbohydrate intakes that have much higher levels of fat oxidation, even at higher intensity levels, we're not seeing a difference in performance. Why would there be no difference in performance if all these things are in fact modulating performance? Because that's the key important point, is that yes, what you're saying is true, but it also is important to contextualize then why is there no difference in performance? Are there other variables that change on the diet that may offset that one single metric around efficiency? Okay. And I didn't even consider this fact, even though our own research has looked at this, that maybe the possibility that elevated ketone levels actually does modulate the oxygen availability and may offset that very reductionist mindset that carbohydrates are more efficient per unit of oxygen. Because maybe you're getting more oxygen potentially in the context, or let me put it this way, maybe you have a greater uptake of oxygen when ketones are elevated. But I never really considered that. And I haven't actually spent much time mentally navigating the possibility of how legitimate that could be. But you actually brought up a really interesting point I never thought about before.
Yeah, and even that, I've spent the past almost 10 years reading research reports like yours and trying to piece things together. But that ultimately is one of the themes that I see all the time, is that our physiology shifts based on what we're fueling ourselves with. And so if our research is based on the physiology of where most humans are at, it could be very different when you take one specific phenotype or one specific genotype and study that specifically. And so it sounds like that may be the case here.
I think it is, in fact. Well, I actually want to confirm something you're saying, because, and it also lends to the bigger conversation, which is when we see athletes lower carbohydrate intake, the metabolic effect of it, it's nearly homogeneous, meaning very consistent. But we also see that there's diversity in how that translates to performance for the athlete, meaning some athletes are performing better on low carbohydrate ketogenic diets and some athletes are performing better on high carbohydrate diets when everything else is controlled, which illustrates that there is clearly some diversity in how someone may respond to these things, to your point around genetics and other variables. Because in these analyses, we actually had the same subject in a crossover fashion, so we're controlling their genetics and their environment, and about half are performing better on one diet and half are performing better on the other diet, which lends to other factors we're not actually capturing these studies, muscle fiber type, who knows, enzymatic changes, all these other things that may be distinguishing between performer or non-performer, which is why ultimately the performance outcome is so important. because all of these variables that lend themselves to performance or non-performance outcomes, if it doesn't translate to performance, the question is how valuable is that to at least the performance context? But if your focus is performance, then you kind of want to see a performance outcome. Otherwise, we're assuming, which is the assumption made around ketogenic diets or low carbohydrate diets around sprint performance. The same assumption has been made around prolonged performance. And when they were actually studied, those assumptions went out the window. But either way, it's certainly coaches, especially at the highest end, have to make assumptions and trial and error things well before science. Otherwise, they're never going to have the best athletes. I can promise you that. Never will they have the best athletes. There's a belief structure in place that, hey, look, this right here is actually improving the athlete's outcomes, even though almost all the abundance of evidence says it's not. Okay, well, then, and actually maybe a deteriorating performance. Okay, now that you know that information, maybe you could actually start to reevaluate in your own head why you see this difference in performance. It probably isn't what you thought it was. Maybe you can eliminate that as a potential reason, and maybe it's something else. You know, maybe there's just like, for example, we think that exercise all these powerful effects, right? We know it improves health, has anti-inflammatory effects, it can improve sleep, it improves muscle function, it improves insulin sensitivity. Which is it that is improving health? Well, hell, it's probably all of it. But if you only focus on one singular metric, you might get lost in assuming that that metric is in fact the important one, even though it might be all of it. It's a composite effect of these things that may be the reason that you see these outcomes and specific metrics. And what I'm alluding to here is in the context of exercise performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about the individuality of when I eat a certain way, it's going to affect my body different than if you eat it that exact same way. So I do want to briefly stay on performance and then transition a little bit more into health effects and the non-elite athletic group. One of the things that I find quite often in nutrition research, regardless of health versus performance, one of the downfalls is so much research does not maintain a type of an eating pattern for long enough to see what the true effects are. And so that is one of the things that it appears that you have done is in your research is to become quote unquote fat adapted, where my body is actually really good at using fat for energy. I have to have that specific dietary pattern for at least 4 weeks in order for my performance to rebound.
It appears to be the case, but there have been a number of researchers who have specifically said that fat adaptation is rapid and can occur within 5 to 6 days. Okay, why are they saying that? Well, let's talk about like the sequence of things that happens on keto adaptation. First thing is at the very first meal, when you reduce carbohydrates, you're reducing the glucose load in the body. Okay, that's number one. Then the very next thing that happens is at the first meal, the insulin response, the overall insulin load begins to drop immediately. Okay. Then around 18 hours in, you start to see an elevation of ketone bodies. So the reduction in glucose load causes a reduction in insulin load, which then ultimately facilitates the key switch in metabolism that facilitates a shift towards glucose and sugar predominant forms of fuel, towards, not exclusively, but towards higher levels of fat as a fuel source. And when higher levels of fat are being burned, ketones are a byproduct of fat metabolism. So ketones start to elevate, which is an easy way of confirming, okay, someone is actually undergoing higher levels of fat metabolism, because you won't have higher ketones, at least in most normal physiologic settings, at least dietarily speaking. You won't have higher ketones without higher levels of fat oxidation, because they're a byproduct of this. So that's what you see within the first 24 hours. Okay, what's the persistent effect over time? So slowly you're going to start to see total overall glucose load drop. You're going to start to see the amount of carbohydrate being oxidized persistently drop over time. We start to see that the amount of fat being oxidized increases. And that tend to happen within the first 5 days, all the way up to a 3-week window. Then they start to normalize. They seem to be pretty normalized at that state. But we know that other things are changed too, like renal metabolism or kidney metabolism, where upon insulin lowering, the amount of sodium and water that's being retained in the body starts to reduce. And so as a result, that starts to persist for 2 to 4 weeks, at least based on a number of analysis, it's somewhere within that range, which is also ironic because a lot of people recommend higher salt loads in perpetuity, even though it appears that maybe the most benefit comes within the first 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, so beyond that first 2 to 4 weeks, You also see changes in perceptions of the foods you're eating. You also start to see changes in other things like nitrogen balance, which is the balance of protein breakdown within the body. All these things are persisting. It appears that the normalization of brain energy metabolism in the form of glucose and ketones appear to peak right around right above 3 weeks. Now, glucose appears to initially drop, at least if you control calories in healthy individuals, immediately, and then slowly starts to creep back up to normalize around 4 weeks. So the normalization of brain energy metabolites when controlling all these other confounding variables like calories, activity, and also key variables around, like, let's say, lean muscle mass, which we've done in our studies, those things, key brain energy metabolites, seem to normalize or peak and or normalize back to normal within around 4 week window. So what happens beyond 4 weeks? Well, it appears like muscle glycogen levels don't normalize probably for beyond 3 months in duration. Reason being is that every single study less than 3 months in duration shows an initial drop off. And then if you look at comparative study analysis, it seems like it drops off and comes right around to around 10% reduction at the 3 month mark. And there's some studies at 9 to 36 months where there's no difference in muscle glycogen or utilization, which is Jeff Volek's FASTER study that has shown that. So there's obviously things that persist potentially as far as months out. But there's a really brilliant paper by a gentleman, two physicians out of Harvard, that actually looked at the duration on diet or dietary studies and look at the timeline for key metabolic changes that occur. And what they're essentially showing is that the key metabolic changes that occur over time, many of which persist well beyond 3 weeks and some persisting even longer than that. So we chose 4 weeks. And this is a long-winded answer to say we chose 4 weeks, but the reason we chose 4 weeks is because of the normalization of brain energy metabolites and prior research that had essentially showed that there appears to be key normalization of things like physical performance beyond that time window. And so we get at getting at least sufficient time on diet to really answer this question, because a lot of the studies prior had been looking, let's say, the most powerful studies published in 2017 and 2021, Louise Burke's group, John Hawley, they do really rigorous, powerful studies and are really prominent in the field, kind of considered like, Louise Burke's kind of considered like, for many people's mind, like the god of carbohydrates and sports nutrition and sports studies. Their studies are always 3 weeks or less in duration. And it isn't because they don't necessarily want to do longer studies. They're usually working with elite level athletic groups who are extremely hard to work with to begin with. And on top of that, you're going to ask them to do a dietary change on top of that for 3 weeks. Like, that's not, this is a little bit of the, I won't say hilarity, but a little bit of the, you very rarely see people criticize the fact that in these analyses, there's not elite athletes. It's a fair criticism, but you find me elite athletes who are willing to undergo a change in their diet for 4 weeks, cross it over for a 2 week plus washout period, and then have a sufficient time on the next diet to allow for the prior diet to no longer interact with the future diet, and for it to be long enough on the diet itself to have the full effects of most of the major effects we know happen on a diet-induced change. Good fucking luck, okay? Not happening. At least in most normal settings. Maybe there's some really brave athletes out there willing to do that, but most aren't. This is also in part why when they say, okay, well, you would expect these things to rise to the top. Okay, higher carbohydrate intake, they're doing it more often. Obviously, it seems to be working or they wouldn't be doing it. Are you sure? Because if that were so true, and some of these athletes are, some of the world's best are getting things like prediabetes and openly disclosing about it, there's clearly got to be some balance here in this discussion, because these higher levels, and that's one of the most pertinent things to my heart around this, because I live with type 1 diabetes also, which is a chronic irreversible metabolic disease. And it has consequences. Like poor control has real day-to-day consequences, and your outcomes are certainly not as bright and shiny as other individuals are. But this idea that, what's happening in these unique settings of elite athletics is inherently the reason that they're performing better is just it's not. It is a interesting and valid argument from a practical sense. But again, it fails to receive sufficient confirmatory reports in the most controlled settings, which actually give us the answers. And there is the potential of some risk for some level of athletes that we have to be careful about and not ignore. Because I don't know if you noticed this, Alex, but no one really talked about the glucose level phenomenon and higher being more common. It was all about ketogenic versus high carb and whether high carb dose responses are really important for elite athletes. No one else was talking about the other effects.
It has been disappointing to observe the heated discussions around this paper with a notable absence of the health considerations of athletes. I personally know many very fit, strong athletes that have confided in me that they're struggling with high blood sugar. It's the biggest reason I'm so invested in this research because it seems likely that athletes with health concerns don't have to choose between peak performance and their well-being. And I do want to come back to athlete health in a bit, but first to finish up the discussion about performance. But yeah, you're mentioning of how do we do studies like this on elite athletes where, okay, we see shifts in metabolism from day one, shifting to a lower carb diet, but the full adaptation takes at least 4 weeks and probably months into the future. And there's so much riding on an elite athlete that are they going to be willing to even experiment with that? And so that's the other thing that the culture of athletic nutrition, and I think both strength-based and endurance-based is very similar, of the immediate assumption is we need lots of carbohydrates. And so my experience is working with mostly competitive athletes, but not the elite athlete. And most of them don't even consider anything about nutrition. And working a lot with high school athletes, and at that level, even coaches are afraid to broach the topic of nutrition, given at that age, we do have to be very careful with body image and making sure that there aren't eating disorders and that type of thing. And so coaches don't even mention nutrition. And so athletes at that age, they're watching the elite of the elite in their craft, and all they know, their mind immediately goes to the I need 120 grams of carbs an hour. I need to have these pasta parties, and that's the culture. And I don't have experience working with elite teams, but I can imagine when an athlete has lived their entire life in the culture of super high carbohydrate, then it's going to be really tough for them to even consider a different approach. I've given a handful of seminars on this very topic, and I've had professional triathletes decline to even come to my talk when they learn that my talk I'm going to be discussing different possible nutrition strategies. They won't even consider it.
Well, I'll give some a point on that, because I have actually worked with elite level athletes. I actually coach some right now, and I will tell you, I've helped people optimize their outcomes, or at least, to the best of our understanding, they're optimizing their outcomes with very high carbohydrate approaches and also very low ketogenic style diets. And both are doing great, right? So there is this diversity, but there is also options, because some of the elite level athletes I work with, they fit right into that category. In fact, you can actually, I pretty much know exactly what's in their team locker room when it comes to food. All of it's focused around the prevailing sports nutrition guidelines. Their sports nutritionists are often following those directly, which makes sense, right? Like, why would they go off the rails and make their own assumptions here? They have to be particularly careful about that with a team that is making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on the line for the sports performance of athletes who are also expensive and in the high millions of dollars, right? So there's a lot riding on that. And so if you're going to buck that tradition and go against the grain, you are putting a lot on the line here. And so, yes, it makes sense that there is a lot of apprehension to do that with these high-level athletes, but there's a risk. There is a risk to making the shift and sustaining it. There's also a risk to not trying. If you don't try, you might be in that 50% who would have responded better to a different nutritional approach, but you never tried, so you'll never know. So that is also a risk, and the risk of not trying, and the risk of never knowing. That's also real, okay? And one of the things that has come out of this is a conversation to this point around a key nutritional debate that's going to be published here soon by some prominent researchers in the field, some of the biggest names ever in sports nutrition. And one of the questions arising is, okay, well, why switch from a high carbohydrate approach if the performance is the same? Okay, like why would do that? Well, you're robbing half of the athlete.
Before you get into that, just to be as blatant as possible, from what you found in lab settings, to purely maximize performance, do we have evidence that athletes won't necessarily experience a decline in performance by shifting to more of a fat-based metabolism?
In the studies that we have conducted that have specifically controlled the macronutrient change to allow for shifts in substrates towards fat-based metabolism, we have not seen a reduction in performance on the average across the entire cohort, across both cohorts of athletes. In fact, we're not the only people to see this. If you go look at the Institute for Sports Science and Nutrition, in our Society of Sports Nutrition, their consensus on ketogenic diets, you'll see a figure in there that I posted on X that looks at studies that have looked at modulating carbohydrate intake. And what you see, at least specifically ketogenic diets, I think it was in figure 1 or figure 2, they show the duration on the diet and sports decline and improvement. And you consistently see this trend of a decline within less than 4 weeks, and above that, greater than 4 weeks, it seems like a consistent trend of improvement in performance. And many of those are confounded by body weight changes and other variables as well. And so we're not the only people to show this in these type of settings where we try to control everything to get out this outcome. But when we control the variables in our analysis, and also looking at other analysis, if you control for time frames and also confounding variables, yes, it doesn't appear that there is a reduction in performance when following a ketogenic diet if you adhere to the diet for at least 4 weeks in duration.
Okay. It sounds like there is some context. Again, not necessarily everybody across the board experiences zero decline, but as a cohort, Correct. There is no decline given enough time to acclimate, so that 4 weeks. And it sounds like there may be a possibility for an increase in performance given enough time. Is there evidence, strong evidence of an increase in performance on a fat-adapted style of racing?
For the average across the population averages, no. If you look at the individual level, yes. The same is true of high carbohydrate diets, right? So at the individual level, it's mixed. Some people are performing better on ketogenic diets, some people are performing better on high carbohydrate diets on an individual level. On the average across the cohort, no, there's no difference. So that's an important distinction to describe there, is the differences at the individual and cohort level.
And that's kind of what I expected your answer to be, and I wanted to stress that because given the high stakes of experimenting, say an elite team experiments with shifting dietary patterns without having a concrete benefit, I think that many teams could deem that as a failure if you're going to risk that much to not necessarily see a benefit. It sounds like across the board there isn't a decline, but there's not on the performance aspect a significant benefit, then that risk is probably just not worth it.
So this brings up a really important point. You are correct. That is how it's currently viewed. And that is often what is stated, is that why would you even risk it? Look what's on the line if there's no differences across the average. With that mindset, you will rob, hypothetically, half the athletes from actually getting the diet that works for them best. Okay? So if you're going to feed the entire team the same exact thing, yeah, you probably want to stick with what you're doing and, hope that it's going to work best, But in reality, at an individual level, you are going to rob some of these athletes of doing something that gives them better outcomes. And that's consistent with the data. You can look at individual responses from our studies and see that there's a mixed impact on which diet they perform better on, okay? Now, some people will criticize and will say, hold on, well, these studies from elite level race walkers from Louise Burke and John Hawley's group, they show consistent declines in performance. Yeah, because it was less than 4 weeks in duration, okay? But once it gets above that level, you're not seeing that anymore at the average, and you're seeing a diversity in performance outcomes across some athletes, which makes a lot of sense why some people are raving to the moon on social media and otherwise, hey, look, I did this diet and it's the reason I perform better. So you bring up someone like Zach Bitter, who's more of a, trying to be more of a centralist on social media, which I commend him for. But he also had his best time of all time, to my knowledge, doing a ketogenic style diet. Not all these athletes are performing better with high carb ubiquitously, right? And so there are real world examples of that also being the case. So, but it's all confounded, right? It's all confounded by these other examples of the noise and the real world and what athletes are doing, all the way up to like the day of. Let's say you're about to race right now, Alex, and I said, you know what, Alex, let's do some mental health training. I'll say, okay, you're going to do terrible. You're going to do worse. You're never going to perform as well. Look at all the training you were doing wrong. Of course, you're not going to do like just simple things like that changes the psychology, not even your metabolism, your nutrition. That alone is such a powerful stimulus for better or worse outcomes, right? So like there's so much that goes into it, which is why we do science. That's why we do these controlled studies, to not have these underlying assumptions left untested. But because you have to control so many variables and be very strict in what you're doing and also make compromises as to, you can't answer every question, which is also one of the criticism that was brought up around the studies. Well, like you didn't do this with the salt intake. You didn't do this with, elite level athletes. You didn't do this with the perfect carbohydrate mixture. Who would? Like, genuinely. You don't see serious researchers bringing this stuff up because they know when it actually gets to doing these studies, how much work goes into it and all the individual nuances that comes down to practically actually conducting these experiments to answer a very specific question. And so in reality, what we're talking about here, Alex, is how you take a study and then attempt to translate it to the real world. So like if you were to look at our review, okay, one of the key take homes is there's two distinct pools of glucose, large glucose pool and the small glucose pool. There's also clear implications on the lack of serious evidence around a dose response in carbohydrates. There's also a lot of questions that are brought up around muscle glycogen levels and carbohydrate oxidation levels as a causal role in performance. There's also clear evidence for the direct role of low glucose levels on actual physiologic changes in physical performance that we've known for years. And so these are some of the most important direct points brought up in the study. But when you go to apply this in the real world, that's just information that you have to filter through what you're working with, the athlete you're working with. Maybe they have cultural considerations, maybe they have lifestyle factors that have nothing to do with the perfect diet of all time. It's just getting them anything that they can consume. And maybe the most practical thing is a high or lower carbohydrate diet. But the reality is at the individual level, if you say that, well, why would you change at all? You will prevent some of the athletes from finding the diet that actually does work best for them. And that would mitigate that athlete's opportunity to reach their peak performance. At least that's what the evidence suggests is the case in these controlled analysis.
Okay. So to summarize and finish up on elite performance, the first takeaway for me on this is some athletes do see performance benefits shifting fat-based metabolism, and some athletes, as of now, seem to perform better on the high carbohydrate style of nutrition. But we won't know. You don't know who you are unless you experiment with that.
Correct.
And probably the off season is the time to do that. So that's the first takeaway: is you may be leaving performance on the table. One of the things that is so interesting to me about the takeaways from your review is you brought up the large glucose pool, or muscle glycogen. It's the sugar that's stored in your muscles that we thought was ultimately driving performance. But your review seems to suggest it's the blood sugar levels, which is ultimately controlled by a smaller glucose pool, the sugar that's stored in our liver, as regulating those blood glucose levels. To me, even if an athlete decides, I want to train and perform on high carbohydrates, just knowing that really what we're trying to do is optimizing the blood glucose via that smaller liver glucose pool, that could alter the way that you're fueling, because you're optimizing for a different variable than previously. All these athletes are optimizing to maximize muscle glycogen, and that doesn't seem to have that big of an impact regardless of the style of nutrition. So if we know what we're trying to optimize, then we can do much better at actually optimizing that in a real life setting.
100% accurate. 100% accurate.
That's one of my takeaways, and why this research is so interesting and vital. But now shifting more towards the everyday person, the everyday athlete, the weekend warrior, yes, they're still trying to improve their performance. They still obviously want to be the best they can, but I want to shift more into the health ramifications, the health implications of all of these other athletes that are striving to improve, but are not understanding those health implications. So if you want to briefly touch on, I know you did a little bit earlier, but get to the core of what are the trade-offs possibly on the health side that these athletes are unknowingly making?
Well, so let's just say first and foremost, if you're an athlete at a higher end, you're probably in great shape, meaning lean. You probably also have high fitness level. You're probably also exercising very regularly. Those are some of the most important things you can possibly do for your overall health. Okay, so first and foremost, checking important boxes in health. However, there are a percentage of individuals who follow higher carbohydrate intakes who are showing consistent elevations in glucose levels that are consistent with prediabetes. What does that mean? That means their fasted levels absent of food, absent of exercise, are elevated. Now, everything we know about that is that's consistent with changes underlying that, metabolically speaking, right? That are not good. Not good. And when we actually attempted to answer the question of, well, hold on, is it even the nutrition that's doing this? What if it's like body composition of the athlete? What if it's the fitness level? What's the age of the athlete? We actually pulled every single study that had continuous glucose monitoring in athletes for at least 7 days. Why? Because that captures a lot of diversity across an entire week. Typically, someone's week is captured. They have consistent patterns, on the Mondays, on the Tuesdays, on the Wednesdays, on the Thursdays, on the Saturdays, and the Sundays, so to speak. And that patterning is pretty consistent across week to week to week. Either way, so we captured 7 days, and then we looked at only fasted levels of glucose. Okay, and then we looked at BMI. Does BMI predict the elevation in blood glucose levels? How do we do that? We look at the scale of BMI in the athlete, and we also look at the scale of glucose levels. And if you expect to see a relationship, you would see that as BMI, our body mass index, increases, so with glucose levels, you see this idealistically a trend if it's giving you any indication. Okay, well, we didn't see that. Why? Because athletes are generally already healthy and lean. Okay, so maybe they're already at the threshold where body composition is not a relevant factor here. Because obviously in the general population, it's a very relevant factor. But maybe in athletes, because they're already in great shape, irrelevant. What about fitness level? We know VO2 max is a great metric of how fit someone is. It certainly would be relevant in the general population, but in athletes, not relevant. We don't see it predicts rising glucose levels. Why? Because they're probably already doing sufficient levels of exercise to satisfy the health criteria involving glucose homeostasis from exercise and insulin sensitivity. Okay, well, what about age? We know that, of course, age is a modulating factor in health and metabolism. We did see a significant association with age. It was not it only explained around 10% of the effect of rising glucose levels, not a major impact like we expected, but reasonable. When we looked at the daily carbohydrate intake of the athletes, we saw that it explained over 30% of the effect in rising blood glucose levels. This is an association, but that's very important because of all the things that we could possibly capture across all these studies that are consistent. We're seeing that actually the amount of carbohydrates consumed in a day is actually a key predictor of that. And actually one of the most prominent proponents and also a researcher and coach who promotes upwards of 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour, at least in my knowledge, 90 to 120 grams per hour in athletes, also just recently published a paper that shows this same thing, that the amount of carbohydrates consumed is predictive not only of daytime glucose levels, obviously, exercise glucose levels, obviously, but not as obvious, but also shown, is it also significantly predicted rising blood glucose levels during the rested, fasted state. Why is that important? There is a percentage of athletes who have prediabetes glucose levels. It is happening. And you know what? It didn't happen in the lower carbohydrate range. It was exclusively happening in the higher carbohydrate range. Why is that? Well, we have to kind of look at the focus around diabetes research. I also want to state that this is not common. Okay, it seems to be a consistent level of individuals that this is happening to in athletic performance. If you're young in the 20s, we weren't seeing this in any of the studies in 20-year-olds. We were seeing it in individuals in studies in the 30, 40s range, even at the very, very high level. So some of these, we captured data points from some collaborative researchers in elite athletes, world champion cyclist teams also. So this is consistent that there's a percentage of athletes who are experiencing this in the fasted state, and the carbohydrates seem to predict it. But
when you say not common, roughly a percentage of athletes that you are seeing this in?
I'm guessing I'm going to guess. This is where I'm going to be very clear. I don't know the exact answer, but the weight of the evidence across the analysis suggests it's somewhere probably between 10 to 30% of them, and it's probably dependent on age as a threshold criteria. Because if you're in the 20s and you're an athlete and you're lean and you're exercising, at least the studies we've looked at, we're not seeing it at all. But in athletes who are pushing, in the 30s, 40 year age range, then we start to actually see like clear signals of anywhere between studies showing as little as like 5%, upwards of 60%. So
it's still not trivial, the number of athletes that are.
Well, zero would be trivial. Okay. So anyone who's getting it at all would be, and obviously I'm being facetious just here, but when thinking about this, I'm suspecting that it's somewhere between 10 to 30, and it increases with age over time, assuming they're all consuming super high levels of carbohydrates and pushing the boundary, so to speak. Then yes. But I think there's some interesting notes here. When we were looking at these athletes, the athletes with the highest blood glucose levels were also the hyper responders to carbohydrate restriction in our analysis. So what it gets to is something you keep alluding to in this conversation, is that there's individual variability even to a phenotype, genotype level, right? Well, there's probably something there, because the individuals who had prediabetes glucose levels were also the athletes that showed the most powerful reduction in glucose in response to carbohydrate restriction. They were the hyper responders. That's oddly convenient, okay? Showing a very consistent phenomenon there. Also, those same athletes that saw the greatest reduction in glucose levels in response to carbohydrate restriction were also the 30% of athletes who had the highest fat oxidation levels ever recorded in the literature. They were hyper fat oxidizers to carbohydrate restriction. So no one focuses on that part of it. That's in the paper. But that actually illustrates potential key biomarkers elucidating who might be great responders to carbohydrate restriction. Maybe if you are seeing rising blood glucose levels, you could be someone who could potentially maximize your metabolic effect of nutritional change by just looking at your continuous glucose response to it on a higher carbohydrate diet, which of course you would probably almost certainly should do if you're running into prediabetes glucose levels.
That's fascinating. The athletes that were showing higher blood glucose sees not just the biggest improvement going on a lower carb diet, but they're the ones that also see the greatest rate of fat oxidation. Period.
Ever reported in the scientific literature. Correct. Over 1.85 grams of fat per minute, which has never been reported in the scientific literature before. One was over 2 grams per minute. And again, I will stress, this is likely an underestimation of the true fat oxidation potential due to the test limitations.
For the layperson, I mean, you're pushing 1,000 calories an hour just via fat metabolism then at those rates. Do you have any ideas why that's the cohort that experiences the highest rate of fat oxidation?
I don't know. I would suspect that they have unique capacity, enzymatically speaking, fiber type, or maybe alterations in something. It's clearly something in their metabolism that allows them to preference fat breakdown and oxidation, and they aren't able to oxidize glucose as well. Because that's my assumption here, because why would you have excess amounts of glucose floating around in the blood if it was being utilized and oxidized efficiently? Why? And there's also studies, Alex, that have shown that athletes who go on long duration endurance bike rides, at the end of those bike rides, when they start to shift fat metabolism, okay, because we see this. You see this like with prolonged cycling or other forms of exercise. There's a crossover point throughout the exercise itself towards fat. In fact, to emphasize this even further, the second best Ironman competitor in the world did a world record time in a laboratory setting, and they actually looked at substrate oxidation throughout that. And we saw that around halfway through the world record time this athlete hit, that they also predominantly shifted towards fat. Okay, so they were maintaining their performance and output and shifting towards fat. Okay, so that showed a couple things. Number one, there's obviously this known phenomenon of shifting towards fat-based metabolism during exercise for long durations, but it also showed that fat can, in fact, fuel. It was over half of the overall world record time. The predominant fuel was fat, and so that tells you something. It tells you something also aligned with the research we're showing before that, yeah, fat does appear to actually be able to sustain these high levels of performance output in the highest of caliber athletes. This wasn't like ketogenic diet. This was on a standard higher carb approach with carb supplementation. But that said, it suggests that individuals, like when we see these studies that show that after prolonged forms of endurance exercise, that there's a shift towards fat metabolism. And then these athletes also do terrible on an oral glucose tolerance test. So they're actually shifting towards fat-based metabolism, and then they become less efficient at glucose metabolism, just based on the energetic demand forced by the exercise itself from endurance exercise. So there's some other things going on here based on prior literature. This is Michael Flockhart's group, and I think it was out of Sweden or Switzerland. But either way, it's fascinating because it clearly shows that there is an inherent disposition in some individuals to preference lower carbohydrate-based approaches, maybe not just for performance, but also for metabolic health metrics, and some of the metrics that all contribute to overall sports performance outcomes. Because we've known for a long time that the athletes who are able to tap into higher levels of fat oxidation during exercise, at least on the context of a higher carbohydrate diet, are associated with better performance. And that's probably not necessarily, what it's showing is a couple things. That also is, some would argue that's tangential, right? If you're exercising at higher volumes, you're going to be able to tap into higher levels of fat because of just training status is improved over time. So that isn't necessarily a signal that fat is associated with better performance. But there's another point. You cannot prevent muscle glycogen breakdown. Okay? You can't. You can slow it down. You can't prevent it. Okay? It's inevitable it's going to decrease. But that's why it's so important to tap into other fuel sources to delay it. Because, for example, when you load huge amounts of carbohydrates, you actually accelerate muscle glycogen breakdown. So in some context, if you're accelerating the breakdown and it does decline precipitously, it's not something you can reverse or undo during exercise. What other fuel source do you have? We have the endogenous form of fat. Because if you just supplement with more carbohydrates, what are you doing? You don't slow down muscle glycogen breakdown. In fact, you can only accelerate it based on the best clinical physiology studies we have. So yes, it is reasonable to think, okay, if you can tap into higher levels of fat, you can actually prolong how long you go before muscle glycogen becomes broken down, which there is logic to what you brought up before. Maybe if you're pushing 90+% of your VO2 max and you have sprint-based performance, that would become a very important form of fuel in those moments. Because our studies with sprint-based performance didn't show that muscle glycogen was irrelevant, okay? What we were showing in that specific study was that athletes were able to sustain high levels of performance with fat oxidation. But fat wasn't the only fuel. It made up the majority of fuel. There was also still carbohydrates being burned in the context of these ketogenic diet athletes. So it's obviously a mixed phenomenon here, but I don't know. There's a lot of context there, and how someone applies it is obviously up to them, but it gets in the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. My mind goes to if the world-class Ironman athlete, throughout his performance, if he's shifting more and more throughout his performance towards fat metabolism, to me, my mind goes to, is the body trying to spare likely liver glycogen for the brain, and therefore shifting more towards muscle performance via fat metabolism.
That is the logical deduction, and also discussed. So right on point. That's discussed in the review, because That gets to another key point of like, what's the purpose of where glucose goes to, and why does it go there? And we talked about, okay, it's going to prevent brain energy deficits. Well, let's talk about that, because if you consume carbohydrates and it converts to individual glucose molecules and elevates blood glucose levels, the pancreas, where insulin is housed, will detect it and release a dose-dependent response in insulin proportional to how high glucose goes. Insulin goes to the liver first. Okay? It is released into the hepatic, which is called the liver, portal vein, and goes straight to the liver. It is well known in clinical physiology studies that the liver will eat 66 to 75% of that insulin. It's the first place where glucose is stored. Why would it go there first, Alex? Because it's probably arguably the most important place to store glucose to ensure survival of your body, particularly your brain, during times of a deficit. Or maybe, in this context, during times of a prolonged strenuous exercise bout where energetic demands are extremely high, that insulin goes to the liver first to prioritize the ability to be utilized when glucose is low in the blood. Because what the liver does, as you know, but other audience members who are listening may not know this, it is one of the only places you store glucose where it can be broken down and re-released into the blood to maintain blood glucose levels. Once you store glucose in the muscle, it doesn't leave the muscle. It stays in the muscle. It cannot be re-released into the circulation. Okay? That's important, because that makes total sense why insulin and glucose would be stored in the liver first, as it maintains the most important tissue, organ, whatever you want to say, in the form of the brain. And then as a result, the actual remaining insulin then, after going through hepatic portal vein, gets to the periphery. Where does it go next? What binds at very high potency to fat, blocks fat breakdown. In the context of higher insulin levels, you're assuming you're in a storage state, not a breakdown state. Okay? So if you're in a storage state, you would stop fat breakdown. Well, what happens when you stop fat breakdown and you're exercising? The only other tissue that has stored energy that you can utilize, at least predominantly, is the muscle and stores glycogen. So you accelerate the breakdown of muscle glycogen levels. Okay? Because insulin's so powerful in the fat tissue, you're dramatically reducing the amount of fat being burned. And it's only when prolonged strenuous exercise is long enough, again, when insulin begins to become precipitously lower, now all of a sudden, you start to shift towards higher levels of fat oxidation. Because you have to. Exactly what you stated, right? And this all makes sense within the context of prioritizing brain energy metabolism, arguably the most important tissue for survival. And it does a heck of a lot to ensure that it survives. And one of the most important ways it survives is ensuring to get adequate levels of energy. The brain requires a near constant level of energy 24/7. Sleep, awake. The only exception to that is actually during exercise, where there's some research that suggests it may elevate subtly, okay? But in general, it maintains a pretty consistent level of metabolic demand, and it's very metabolically hungry. It consumes quite a number of calories throughout the day. And as a result, it has to be fueled. And if all these muscle tissues are starting to work and steal that, what is it going to do? It's going to shift around metabolism to ensure that it is sustained. It gets sustainable energy, which is also why, Alex, when molecules like ketone bodies and lactate, which only typically elevate, evolutionarily speaking, in low intake environments. So like caloric deficit, right? That's when ketones would be elevated because it causes low glucose and low insulin environment. Well, when ketones are present, they're utilized in a dose-dependent manner by the brain. That makes sense, right? It would be utilized in proportion to its presence, and then glucose metabolism goes down proportionally. Because the brain only utilizes glucose proportional to its energetic requirements. So that means if you have super high glucose levels, brain glucose metabolism does not increase. But if you have super high ketone levels in the blood, brain energy ketone metabolism does increase, and it's directly proportional to the amount of ketones present. Why? Because the brain, when it knows that an alternative fuel is present, which typically signals a compromised environment, let's say in a famine where ketones would be rapidly elevated, oh yeah, it makes sense. Okay, let's shift towards ketones and allow that to be the primary substrate. Same thing with exercise. When lactate is high due to prolonged exercise, it also is used in a dose-dependent manner proportional to its presence, meaning that it makes sense yet again that the brain is prioritizing itself over everything else, which is why the de-emphasis of the brain as a key modulator of performance is such an important mistake in sports performance, because it is going to protect itself at all costs. And yes, it is seen and is occurring in exercise environments like endurance sports and otherwise, okay? And that mechanisms that drive that are still applicable and relevant in other sports contexts, which is, again, the whole point of this review.
There's a lot there. So let's frame this as in 3 or 4 months, I have an Olympic distance triathlon. I'm a good athlete, but I wouldn't consider myself elite. So I'm 2.5 hours for this Olympic distance. So 2.5 hour race, an endurance race. My entire life, I've been doing the sports nutrition thing of high carbs for training, for races and everything. So I have 4 months to get ready for this. So listen to this podcast and my takeaway. So my body is already utilizing some fat as I go through a race. And it appears that I want to save as much glucose, much sugar for my brain as possible so I don't go into hypoglycemia. Now, there are other fuel sources, ketones and lactate, that can fuel my brain. But it seems like maybe I should try and train my body to maximize the fuel, the fat, that my body already is going to do some of during the race. And so if I can train my body to use more of that fat, it's going to spare other fuel sources for my brain, which seems to be one of the ultimate dictators of performance. So is there any biological reason that I shouldn't specifically focus, at least for the next month or two, on maximizing my ability to burn fat for fuel?
Okay, so most athletes are in endurance context of 2 hours or greater are going to find themselves in environments where fat is an extremely relevant fuel source. You also have to consider your availability of access to fuels during the event. Okay, and most settings nowadays you're going to have access to it. And it's a lot harder during a swim per se and we see this consistently if it's in a swim-based event, to actually get access to carbohydrates or even logistically consume them while swimming, right? Because obviously for clear reasons. So in that context, what is often recommended, even from traditional sports nutrition guidelines, is the possibility of training low carbohydrate and performing high, meaning you're constantly trying to force your body through nutritional manipulation and also training to maximize fat potential as a fuel substrate. Now, we know that nutrition is the most powerful way to do that, right? Nutrition is the most powerful way to manipulate what you're actually metabolizing. Now, what would be the risk? The risk is more so in doing this the wrong way. Okay, there's definitely a wrong way to do this. One of which is just to willy-nilly, flippantly reduce carbohydrates and just, see what happens. Terrible idea, okay? You should probably plan out a well-formulated low-carbohydrate ketogenic strategy that has appropriate minimal supplementation throughout the first windows of time. Also track your adaptation window. Look at things like continuous glucose monitoring to ensure brain energy metabolism is sustained and normalized in the fasted set. So have someone who can actually look at your CGM data retrospectively and see that you did actually come back to normalization. Track ketone levels as well to see that you reach peak ketone levels that your body is producing and then is plateauing over time. And look at, and also track body weight, because obviously initially you're going to have some drops in body weight, and all these things need to be accounted for and or relevant. One of the biggest mistakes I've seen, because I've talked to a lot of elite level performance coaches besides myself, who've also had athletes go on ketogenic diets and like, yeah, they never got that top end anymore. And they said, but we never knew we were supposed to give carbohydrates during exercise. We thought we were never going to bonk. One of the biggest mistakes was the athletes not doing that. Intuitively, people like Zach Bitter were doing that already. They were already consuming some degree of carbohydrates. There were other athletes as well. Ben Greenfield, who was a top performing athlete, ketogenic diet for an extended period of time. He was also doing that. I think he also acknowledged somewhere around 30 grams per day. So intuitively, a lot of these athletes who were performing extremely high some of which, again, in Zach's case, hit actually his best world record time to my knowledge. He hit a world record time. I think his best time was actually doing that approach. He can correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure he will. But either way, these approaches have to be done with the right nuance and context with someone who can guide you on the approach. One thing that I used to do on myself is I used to calorie equate, keep protein constant, and subtly shift over a 6 to 8 week window by slowly calorie equating over 6 to 8 weeks, a shift towards more fat. And I found that I had no adaptation issues whatsoever. And I also did that because I have type 1 diabetes, and so the consequences on insulin can be quite profound. And so I was able to mitigate nearly all of those issues by just slowly titrating over time, and had no of these purported symptoms. But you'd want to have some idea or biometric that it's actually working for you or it's actually performing you. Obviously, your performance output is one of the best metrics, but if someone immediately shifts into a lower carbohydrate approach and wants to rapidly adapt, we know that within the first less than 4 weeks, they're typically going to see some initial drop-off. Now, the performance differences that were reported for 3 weeks in duration and 5 weeks or 5 days in duration was around 2% difference, which in the grand scheme of things is absolutely irrelevant for the average person. But that would be the difference between first and second place elite level athletes. Mm-hmm. So it's doing it judiciously with a set plan, and you probably want to consult someone who knows what they're talking about. Okay?
So this is where you either hire Andrew or myself as nutrition coaches.
You should hire Alex for sure. Okay, at high energy, hire him. He knows what he's doing, and he's very educated on this topic. But in all, I'm actually serious. But also on a different note, no, it's super important because there's nuance in this. So, for example, I have type 1 diabetes. I've done the ketogenic diet for over a decade. In fact, I'm the longest lived patient in the scientific literature to have a longitudinal report administering a sustained ketogenic diet in an advanced cardiovascular disease, so which is over 10 years in duration. And so you learn a lot about the nuance when you actually apply it in the real world. And so here's what you should look for. You should look for, number one, who's credible and knowledgeable. Number two, has done it before, idealistically, not just only in themselves, but also help guide other people to success on the approach. You don't want to look for someone who's like, yeah, I did someone on a ketogenic diet and they did terrible. Like, all right, probably not the person I'm looking for, right? You want to find someone who has actually found success because there's probably something within their approach that accounted for that success. And it gives you a higher likelihood of seeing the same thing. Same recommendation I give to people who are trying to use nutrition as a tool for their obesity or diabetes or one of these other settings where there isn't a how-to guide for optimization. That's real world. Okay, that's application in the real world. And so I say, look for someone who's either done it themselves or even better, has guided someone else to doing it along the way. And even better, if they have advanced knowledge on the topic so they can actually help figure out for your unique situation, because you will be unique, how you're responding to it and how to adapt to it, understanding the physiology and biology of the approach, right? And so in that case, it provides a lot of tools in the toolbox to give you the highest probability of success when it's all said and done. It doesn't guarantee success. In fact, it never does. But it dramatically increases it, which is what every athlete's hoping for.
Yeah, that's a really important nuance. I mean, I've learned just as much from coaching as I have from reading research. So outside of hiring a coach that knows what they're doing and giving yourself time, that minimum 4 weeks, if not multiple months, to see if it's the right approach for you. So as this athlete that's trying to adapt, do I need to go truly ketogenic, as in drop those carbs very low, which low is contextual within your activity levels, but very low, ketogenic, or can I say I'm just going to drop my carbs down to 100 to 150 grams on my training days and still experience those similar benefits on a somewhat similar time frame? So,
and just to clarify, you're asking if you were just to lower the carbohydrates into what you're calling, actually this is defined by low carbohydrate intake. So if you're, so let me define this real quick. So ketogenic diets are less than 50 grams of net carbohydrates per day. And then low carbohydrate is essentially 50 to 130. And this is all based on percentage of calories too. So less than 10% of total calories by carbohydrate is typically considered ketogenic. And then somewhere between 10 to 25% is low carbohydrate, 25 to 45% is moderate carbohydrate, and then 45 is high carbohydrate. 65 or higher, super high levels of carbohydrate. So are you asking about just going to low carbohydrate here? Is that the context?
Correct. Can I just go low carbohydrate and still experience similar benefits versus that below 50?
It's hard to say because very little research has actually looked at that level. Most of it has looked at the ketogenic range because it's more a clear, distinct physiologic state. And that, again, at the ketogenic state, at the lower end, we don't see deteriorations in performance. And so the question is, you could test this yourself. This is something that's, so if someone who wants to take a practical guide on what to do, how would you test this in yourself? Well, again, you can do some multiple week shifts to mitigate some of the keto symptoms or flus, potentially. Or you could potentially just reduce carbohydrates to a set level that doesn't necessarily put you into ketogenesis because you're still going to pull a lot from carbohydrates at that lower carbohydrate range. But you will get into lower insulin environments on the average that would allow for individuals to more often tap into fat. But I will also say it's not as certain because if you look at all the evidence, you do not reliably and consistently see a reduction in insulin to sufficiently low amounts to induce a clear metabolic change at the low carbohydrate range. Okay, so if you really want to shift towards higher fat oxidation levels, you don't always consistently see that across studies, at least in other contexts outside of athletics, in these low carbohydrate ranges. So you're risking the possibility you won't actually get into a higher fat oxidation state. But you can always test that, right? If you have access to a lab who's going to be able to run a VO2 max test or whatever, you can actually see, relatively speaking, or if they do a sustained exercise approach. And if you're an Olympic athlete, you should have access to those tools. If you don't, you better reconsider what you're doing because Olympic level athletes usually have access to some of the best tools in the world. Heck, you come to our lab and do stuff like this. We do a lot of elite level athlete testing. You can actually look at how your substrate oxidation for fat and carbohydrates is shifting over time if you have access to one of these analysis tools.
So I need to give myself enough time. I really should, if I want to be confident that I'm giving myself a true test, I really should look to go fully ketogenic for a time. That's what it sounds like. Now I'm concerned. Am I, like you mentioned, some elite athletes seem to lose their top end. So I'm concerned if I do this, am I going to lose any ability to burn carbohydrates for fuel at that elite level? Am I shifting myself out and you know what, now I have to actually actively work and train to get myself back to where I was on the carbohydrate top end speed?
So when you go to full ketogenic diet and when we've gone to over 85% of VO2 max, we see that around 55% of the fuel is coming from fat and around 45% is coming from carbohydrates. So you're still using carbohydrates. It's not going away. It's still being utilized. But sustainably longer periods on the diet would likely ensure you have more full muscle glycogen levels so that you have a more prolonged period of time where if you needed to utilize other fuel substrates, you might have some of that on board. There's a lot of reasons why longer is better. And that might seem somewhat conflicting with what I've said before from the lack of impact on muscle glycogen levels. But I want to be clear, when we're talking about elite level athletics, what we're talking about here is for the average person, you can go to my Instagram right now and look at the comments on many of the things around this study. And you'll see most of the comments are talking about, well, can I still lose weight while exercising fasted or on ketogenic diets? And do I maximize fat oxidation? The concern is so far removed from what fuel substrate you're pulling from for the average person. But for elite level athletics, where you're pulling from and for how long and when and where is highly relevant to them, particularly for long duration exercise bouts where you are stripping away your endogenous sources while trying to potentially bring in some exogenous source to maximize your total energetic need and output. So the truth is that we don't necessarily know the answer to that question. Obviously, we would have to speculate. And I'm speculating there when I say I think longer adaptation on the diet because of some of the work from Jeff Volek's study showing functional muscle glycogen levels. It would be interesting to see if a ketogenic diet with full muscle glycogen levels has any potential difference. Our review says it wouldn't matter, okay? And everything we said prior to this says it wouldn't matter. But I'm also open-minded that I'm wrong. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe a longer adaptation increases enzymatic capacity to further enhance fat oxidation. And then you also have the ability to tap into some degree of muscle glycogen utilization. At least in that study, it showed that muscle glycogen was being utilized and it was restored to the same degree in these athletes, which is fascinating as well. Again, emphasizing that the diet is not the reason that someone is physiologically superior or not in the performance context. Again, that's more of a metabolic context.
I'm also now going to speculate on my end, and maybe you have an answer for me. So if we're looking at, right, so the small glucose pool, liver blood glucose levels, brain fuel, glucose obviously is one of those possible fuels, but we have lactate and ketones. So on the lactate front, as an athlete growing up, I always heard that lactic acid, it builds up in your muscle and it's the burning sensation. And there's the VO2 max threshold, but then there's a less intense threshold of the lactate threshold of how long can you actually sustain endurance activity over half an hour, hour, and beyond. So to me, just at a high level, if I'm just casually thinking about it, okay, so there's a lactate threshold where there's too much buildup of that lactate, but it's also a fuel for my brain. So where is that disconnect? Wouldn't I want to be producing more lactate so that I can fuel my brain? Yet it's this restriction of the lactate threshold?
So great question. I think the trade-off is in favor of less because you obviously have some effects to the acid load, and the amount that it would be fueling in your brain is not typically significant enough to substantiate its beneficial effect of offsetting brain energy deficit. So in that context, and you wouldn't, and obviously if you're pushing those thresholds for long enough, it's not going to, there's a limit to how long that's going to happen, right? And so you could much more easily fuel with just providing exogenous forms of like glucose in very small quantities and totally make up that without having to sacrifice pushing that threshold for that period of time, which obviously in certain contexts would not be ideal. Obviously the muscle burning sensation, but there's also the difficulty in actually clearing it as well. And so it's just, in my opinion, the trade-off is not necessarily worth it. You could just supplement with something like glucose and or ketones that don't necessarily have the requirement of pushing yourself into a lactate threshold and sustaining it to actually have any level that wouldn't actually be as sufficient or high enough to replace something you could easily replace by just an exogenous source of carbohydrates in small quantities.
So I'm not trying to maximize that lactate production.
Correct.
Which brings me to the other question. So my understanding is lactate is a product largely of glycolysis or early metabolism of carbohydrates. So if I am maximizing my fat oxidation for fuel versus the high carb approach, is my rate of lactate production lower on a fat metabolism versus a high carb approach?
So we've actually looked at this in lactate levels in athletes who've done the ketogenic diet, and lactate levels are typically a little bit higher across multiple studies. Now, lactate levels in the blood are not just a measure of production, they're also a measure of clearance, okay? And a lot of times we're not getting both production and clearance, we're just getting the net. And so we don't necessarily know here, Alex, about your question around production. But we know the net effect is that it's actually slightly higher on many ketogenic diet studies. And we've actually looked at this. In the study where we actually looked at Ironman competitors, we saw that in the Ironman competitors who did a ketogenic diet for 6 weeks in duration, at the end of that 6 weeks, and they did a time to exhaustion trial for over 2 hours in duration, we found that those individuals on a low carbohydrate diet had a higher incidence of hypoglycemia, but yet performed identically to the higher carbohydrate approach, despite hypoglycemia being notorious for causing brain energy deficit and performance decline. But when I went back and analyzed after the study was published, the total amount of calories from glucose, ketones, and lactate, all brain fuels in the blood, versus the high carbohydrate diets, ketones, glucose, and lactate, they were identical in the amount of circulating brain energy caloric equivalents in the blood. Okay, so to the point, yes, I mean the total is what matters here. At least in my opinion, that's what our research is showing, our review is showing, and that's what actually our randomized control trial also showed. But it's hard to say, because there's not like a lot of tools to just exogenously administer lactate either. I'm sure there's already a company right now that's a supplement for lactate. I'm sure it's if it's not already there, it's coming, and that would be interesting. It would be interesting to see a glucose ketone lactate supplement. Sorry, I just ruined everyone's patent rights by bringing it up on this podcast. But like it's potentially an idea. Obviously, they're already administering glucose plus ketones. I actually administer exogenous ketones on myself sometimes because I have type 1 diabetes, and I've found that things like exogenous ketones, I've used things like, we've done studies in like Ketone IQ or other products like that. There's like a lot of things out there, but either way, that actually prevents not only the incidence of how quickly hypoglycemia may initiate, at least in my personal experience, but I've also seen there's research that shows that rescuing from low brain energy environments, low glucose environments of hypoglycemia, you actually rescue quicker when you rescue with ketones and glucose. So either way, there's a lot of reasons why someone would consider not just glucose as a fuel to fuel during exercise for maintaining brain energy metabolism. There's other potential contexts as well where even supplementing with some of these can be potentially valuable.
So it sounds like there's a lot of research yet to be done. So on the lactate front of muscle load versus muscle clearance into the bloodstream and levels there. And so then moving into ketones, then it sounds like you've done exogenous ketones, and that is a big thing in athletics right now. I personally have not experimented myself with that. I would love to. I mean, I've performed quite often in a ketogenic state, so I'm producing endogenous ketones. I haven't done the exogenous myself. Longer term with ketone production, my understanding there's a lot of really interesting research into ketones upregulating mitochondrial biogenesis. So not even just fuel for the brain in the short term during a day-to-day training session or a race. Over time, being in more of a ketogenic state, there may be potential improvements via producing more mitochondria to increase the rate of that ATP production. Is there potential there?
There's definitely research that has shown that in some model systems for sure. How much it translates to human-based environments is hard to say, although a lot of the evidence around ketogenic style therapy seems to be supportive of, I'll just say in quotes, and people get upset when you say these terms like mitochondrial health. With air quotes around that because it's an undefined-ish term. But yes, you are. It is true. There's some work like BYU and other labs that have shown that.
Another adaptation that most of the time is a drastic reduction in inflammation. And that appears to possibly be a benefit of training in that state, in that you could potentially have a higher training load given that you're clearing inflammation quicker. But then on the flip side, inflammation is a really important reaction by your body as part of healing. So I would assume that there is an overall benefit. Is there a detriment in certain circumstances of too low of inflammation post-workout towards recovering and healing?
Yeah, and I'll kind of I'll part on this note because I think this is a really important question based on our time. But I'll say that there is clear evidence that blunting reactions or adaptations to exercise by reducing an inflammatory response can actually cause detrimental effects. Like when people use NSAIDs post-exercise, it can blunt the adaptive response to exercise. But ketones are not in the same category as NSAIDs. NSAIDs are direct blockers. Ketones are signaling molecules that can block the formation of certain key inflammatory molecules, not all. Okay, like NLRP3 inflammasome, IL-1 beta, we know can be modulated by ketone levels, right? But that's not all inflammatory signals. So I'll just say it's very context dependent there, but we don't see that issue. Even though we do see that on ketogenic diets, people tend to have lower inflammatory levels. And this was an analysis, systemic review, and ketogenic diets, and also pain. That it appears that in about 70% of studies on the ketogenic diet, you reduce inflammation in individuals. But what's really important to contextualize there is when we think about the ketogenic diet, it's also a holistic approach that removes a lot of other forms of foods that may be inducing inflammatory states. So just simply removing those can be potentially positive. So, yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I have so many other questions that I would love to have you back sometime to go through, but you already gave me multiple hours of your time, so very, very grateful. And yeah, keep up the great research. I think it's fascinating, just on a personal level, as well as in informing how I might coach my own clients. So thanks so much for joining.
Amazing. Well, it's an honor here, Alex. I truly appreciate it. And the passion is very noticeable. You clearly brought some of the most passion to the conversation and most interest and curiosity to learn, which I wish we'd see a little bit more of. But either way, honor to be here.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
All right. Talk soon.
Andrew had to step out before I could ask him where all of you can find him if you want to follow what he's doing as well. And so I thought I'd add that at the end here. So you can find Andrew at Andrew Koutnik, Koutnik, andrewkoutnik.com. That's his own personal website. He is on X at @Koutnik, and he's on Instagram at Andrew Koutnik PhD. So I will be following closely all of his future research, but you can go directly to the source and follow Andrew on all those platforms. You can also learn more about Carly and myself, our coaching, long-form writing, and other podcast recordings at highenergylife.com. That's HIenergylife.com.
Thanks for tuning in. We're here to help you put what you've learned into action. Learn more about our coaching program at highenergylife.com. That's HIenergylife.com. Until next time, embrace nuance, ask questions, and always reserve the right to change your mind.